This morning's reading is brought to us by Liam and Ellie, and it's taken from Revelation chapter 8.
Revelations chapter 8. When he opened the seventh seal, there was a silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw 7 angels who stand in the presence of God. 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel with a gold incense burner came and stood at the altar. He was given a large amount of incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the gold altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints went up to the presence of God from the angel's hand. The angel took the incense burner and filled it with fire from the altar and hurled it at earth. There was a rumbling of thunder, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake.
Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. 1/3 of the earth was burned up, 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all of the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. 1/3 of the sea turned into blood, 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star blazing like a torch fell from the sky on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. 1/3 of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and 1/3 of the sun was struck, 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars, so that 1/3 of them turned dark. 1/3 of the day was without light, and also 1/3 of the night.
I looked again and heard an eagle flying overhead, crying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to those who live on earth, because the remaining trumpet blasts of the 3 angels are about to sound."
Well, thanks, guys. So this morning in our text, the final seal has been opened and a deafening silence descends over God's throne room for a curiously specific length of time, 30 minutes, before something new happens. John tells us that 7 angels have now appeared with 7 trumpets, and they're about to blow these trumpets. But before they do anything, another messenger comes forward, lifting up a censer, which is like a giant bowl that's filled with incense that's being burned and offered up before God. It represents the prayers of all the saints. Now, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the profound thought that all the prayers of all the believers across time, all gathered together, being offered up in the throne room, in this room outside of time, in the timeless wonder of heaven. They're lifted up to God in worship, and then the prayers to God, the prayers of God's people, bring about a result. The martyrs have prayed for justice, and here we see justice is served. But it's not like the kids' song, "The blessings come down as the prayers go up," you know that? Instead, it's now prayers go up and the fire comes down. The messenger retrieves coals from the altar of God, not man-made fire, but fire that God made himself. And this fire is cast down upon the earth, causing thunder and lightning and earthquakes and a final judgment upon the earth. This is not a popular message, but let's dig in. There is an important point that we need to visit here that we've talked about before. We've mentioned this before, that the account that we read in the book of Revelation is not intended to be a chronological, this follows this, follows this, follows this kind of account of how the world will end, but rather, this is an apocalypse. It's an unveiling. It's John inviting us to see our present struggles and the present power structures that appear to be ruling the world in a new light. John invites us to see the world a new way. The seals that we've been reading about for the past several weeks are now followed by 7 trumpets. It begins here in chapter 8 and extends all the way into chapter 11. Now later, there's going to be 7 bowls. that are going to start in Revelation 16 and 17. But these are not meant to be seen as consecutive events, one that follows after another in a sequence, but rather these 7 judgments, the 3 times, are all meant to be different perspectives on the same end times events. Notice how the 7 trumpets emerge out of this 7th seal. It's kind of like those nesting Russian dolls that you open up, and then inside of one doll is the next one. Later, the 7 bowls of judgment that we'll read about in Revelation 16, they will emerge as part of the 7th trumpet. So every time, each of these 7 contains the next 7. And each of these 7 judgments are purposeful. They're designed to bring about the repentance of the inhabitants of the earth. That they are not just elaborate temper tantrums that God is throwing on his throne. They are measured and they are calculated, and they're working towards a final outcome. God has heard the prayers of his people, and God is acting on them. And we don't always understand what's happening. We don't understand how what's taking place is fulfilling God's purposes, but we trust. Now, I would also like you to notice that in each of these 7, that final one always has a final judgment, a purifying fire that brings about something new. So this final seal features fire, the final trumpet features fire, and then the final bowl features fire. Each time we are returning to the same vision of the same events from 3 different perspectives. So, unlike the seals, the trumpets that begin here in chapter 8 are inspired by word images from the plagues in the Exodus story. So first we've got the hail in verse 7, and then the sea is turned to blood in verse 8, and then the water is poisoned in verse 10, and then darkness falls in verse 12. All the while there's this 1/3 motif that keeps happening again and again and again. 1/3 of the land is set ablaze. 1/3 of the sea creatures die. 1/3 of the water is poisoned. 1/3 of the sun, moon, and stars, and so on. So what does all that mean? Well, of course, there's lots of theories out there. Now, some of them operate with the assumption that the seals refer to a previous past time, that the trumpets talk about a present time, and then the bowls that we'll read about later talks about the future, which is a nice theory, but I can't make it work with the trees, water, animals, the sun, moon, and stars as I see them today. How about you? It is the plagues of Egypt that are sort of being revisited over again, but what are we supposed to notice about that? Again, John isn't giving us a cookbook here for how to end the world, but instead, John is using these vivid word pictures to make a point. So what is that point? I take the 1/3 motif that is recurring here in these trumpets to represent that God's judgment is not overwhelming, but it is controlled and it is careful. It is surgical and precise. Now, by comparison, in Zechariah chapter 13, there's a vision there where 2/3 of all life and all property are destroyed. So this is a different word picture for a different time. Now here, in chapter 8, there are 2 big themes at work. One of them is clearly visible, while the other one is hidden right now, and it will be revealed in chapters 9 and 10. We're having difficulty reconciling these 2 themes, God's wrath and God's mercy. Now, on the one extreme, we sometimes perceive God as the high and holy judge whose well-deserved righteous wrath is being poured out on humanity that continues to refuse to recognize God's sovereignty and power. So for some of us, that image has a lot of resonance that really captures how we see and how we experience God. Now, on the other hand, we see from God another picture, a picture of God's mercy and God's love, of God's compassion and God's care, God's forgiveness that's seen through Jesus Christ and is demonstrated by his death on the cross. So we have these two pictures of God's wrath and God's mercy, and we're trying to reconcile them. And so you might have the question, okay, well, which one's right? Or which one is the one that we currently are under? And I think those are the wrong questions to ask. Consider in Exodus chapter 24, starting in verse 5. Moses goes back up the mountain to receive a second set of the tablets of the covenant because, well, he broke the first set. And there we read, the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with Moses and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of their parents to the third and to the fourth generation. Now, what I like about that verse is it challenges us. It doesn't give us an either or. It's this one or this one. But instead, as God comes and proclaims his essence, his nature to Moses, God says it's both. It's not one or the other. It's both. It's not a mistaken impression. It's not one now and another later. It's not one and the other one's wrong. We have trouble reconciling these two seemingly contradictory images of who God is and what he's like, but both of them are true. Typically, one of them is a little easier for us to understand, but they're both real and they're both true. So what do we take from these word pictures that appear here in Revelation chapter 8? Well, let's do a little bit of memory work. Think back to Exodus and think back to the plagues that are described in Exodus chapters 7 through 11. How many plagues are there? So take a moment with those of you that have families and just kind of get a sense from your group. How many plagues do you think there are? Now, I'll keep my eye on the chat box and I'll see if we get anybody that's got the right number. How many plagues were there in the story in Exodus? Tick, 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 tick. I'll give you a few more seconds. We'll see if you can consolidate your answer. The correct answer is 10 total. 10 plagues. Now, how many of those plagues can you remember? Now, I'll give you a clue. In our reading in Revelation today, there are at least four of them that are captured in the four trumpets that we talked about today. See how many of the plagues that you can remember. I'll give you about 30 seconds here, and then I'm going to put the answer up on the screen. So working together with those in your group, or if you're on your own, take out a scrap of paper and see if you can write down how many of these plagues there are. "15 seconds. Okay, let's see how you did. Well, I hope you caught some of those. maybe spend some time today with your family and read through that story. Now, if you get a chance to do that, I would like you to remember not just 10 plagues and what order they came in and all these horrible things, but with your family, I would like you to remember the question of why. Why was God sending those plagues? What was the purpose? Was God having a temper tantrum, and was he just acting out against these people that he hated? Was he trying to get Egypt to let his people go? Is it a punishment, a just punishment for the sins of Egypt that had piled up over the years? Well, whether or not that is true, God's purpose ultimately here is to redeem his people, and the plagues are part of it. The plagues are part of the cost. The plagues are part of the deliverance. The plagues also bring glory to God. As we read the conquest narratives that come later, all the nations around Israel heard the stories of Israel's deliverance. This year's Bible Day Camp theme was supposed to be about this wilderness adventure where Moses leads his people out of Egypt and through the Sinai desert into the promised land. And as they're arriving, the nations are in terror because they've heard these stories of the terrible plagues, the deliverance through the Red Sea, and how God had looked after his people. The plagues are part of it. They're part of the deliverance. The plagues bring about God's glory, perhaps in ways that we don't understand, perhaps in ways that we find really difficult to accept. The plagues were meant to lift up the name of God. Now, there is one other reason for the plagues, and it's one that we find very troubling. The plagues weren't to get Pharaoh to change his mind. Actually, the plagues were ultimately to harden Pharaoh's resolve. In Exodus chapter 5 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, 8 separate times in the story, it's mentioned how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, this does not sit well with modern individualist, I have authority over my body and my own life people of the 21st century. But there it is. God acts and God does, and we are not consulted on it. Sometimes we don't know what God's up to, and sometimes we're not sure what God is even accomplishing. But God is sovereign, and sometimes God acts in ways that just require us to trust. In some ways, our deliverance is through the suffering that we have of this life. That followers of Jesus Christ are not delivered from suffering, they are delivered through suffering. Sometimes the suffering that life brings is meant to train us for his glory. And Revelation, with its vivid word pictures, invites us to tune our minds, tune our ears and our eyes to a different kind of reality. One that's more in step with God's nature and with God's character. In 1905, Mary E. Brine was an expert in Middle Irish Gaelic, and she discovered 2 poems that were probably written by an 8th century Celtic Christian poet. His name was Saint Delan of Forgale. Now, they were tucked away in the pages of some newer books that were only perhaps 200 or 300 years old, in a church library, but these poems had been lost for centuries. So she translated and then published a translation of these poems, and they were later converted into verse by Eleanor Hull, and then they were combined with a good old-fashioned Irish drinking song and became the hymn, "Be Thou My Vision." Now, it's a curious song in the sense that it's modern, it's 20th century, it was written just over 100 years ago, but the verse that inspires the words of the hymn come from a theological time frame that's ancient. You see, the Western Christian Church expanded across Gaul and came into what we call England now, into Scotland and then Ireland in the 4th century. So if you want to read up on that history, just look up St. Patrick and read a little bit about his story and how he brought the gospel to Ireland. Now, the Roman Empire collapses in the 5th century, and then all these structures of control for the church just kind of retreat back into the old Byzantine Empire. And so for hundreds of years, the Celtic church just kind of grew and developed on its own. It developed its own attitudes and its own theories about eschatology and of atonement. It's kind of like a time capsule for the earliest thought on who God is and what God is like. Now, today, our thinking about church within Churches of Christ is quite Protestant. It's very Western, very, very modern. We tend to see atonement as satisfying the demands of an angry God, a God that our sin has ticked him off, and somebody's got to pay the bill. And this kind of thinking is actually inspired by a guy named Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. It would have been thinking that's quite foreign to the Irish poem writer who inspired the verse that became the words to that song that we listened to just a few minutes ago. The hymn Be Thou My Vision uses a Celtic title for God that's quite special, High King of Heaven. Now, Roman Christians in the 10th century would probably have thought that title to be pagan and vulgar, or at the very least not biblical. But it outlines a kind of thinking that's quite helpful. In Ireland in the Middle Ages, your village would have a chieftain, and the village near you would have another chieftain. And then over all of these chieftains, there might be a clan leader or a king that would rule over them. But then there would be the High King. Now the High King would be the King of Kings, and he would rule over perhaps all the land you had ever seen in your entire life. The High King was so far removed from your experience, you could probably live your whole life without having ever seen him. He had authority, of course, and a healthy modicum of fear is called for, but it would be hard for you to imagine having any impact on this king. You could scarcely offend him. You'd never meet him in your entire life. And he might as well be on a different planet. So imagine not just the High King, but the High King of Heaven. So glorious, so lofty, that us peasants, we don't even register with such power and magnificence. Our failings and our foibles don't offend this king. We're like ants. We're less than ants to the High King of Heaven. This King of Kings would not even notice. But this High King of Heaven has in fact visited our world and visited our village. And in fact, this High King of Heaven has become a peasant just like us. The High King has come down and has made fellowship with his people through his Son. That's the gospel of the 7th century in Ireland. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou art my best thought by day and by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. High King of Heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of Heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, O bright heaven's sun. Heart of my heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. That is the good news for the Celtic Christian of the 8th century. If the High King of Heaven transforms our lives with suffering, well, we can trust that he knows what he's doing and that it's for our good. We just want to see the world the way the High King of Heaven does. God is not some vain, petulant king that's wounded by every slight and suffers every offense, responding with bitter wrath. We know that God's wrath is not punishment for sin because God has atoned for all sin, that God has suffered the penalty for all sin. How much of our sin is nailed to the cross? How much of it? All of it. All of it is nailed to the cross. Past, present, future. God suffered all wrath on the cross so that we might be set free. Present suffering is not the product of God's wrath. All God's wrath is gone. We have been set free. The high King of heaven has come down and become a peasant just like us. Now, God's love is infinite, and even his wrath must be for some purpose, even one that we can't understand. So we wait God's judgment, trusting that it will bear witness to his greatness and bring him glory. Now, we still need to ask for help when we need it. I am not suggesting that we just suffer and whistle Dixie while the house burns down around us. This pandemic has hit some families very hard, and while others, it hasn't hit them hardly at all. Consistent with everything else in this broken world, even a pandemic is seemingly unfair and inconsistent. It doesn't make sense. But by God's grace, we wait for God's deliverance. And by God's grace, we ask for help from people when we need it. So if you are in a season of suffering, and if you need help, please ask me. Or please ask one of our elders. Or please reach out to someone who's part of this church family. And reach out to them. And receive the help that you need. Here in Revelation chapter 8, John invites us to see the high King of heaven glorious on the throne. The trials of this earth are then for his glory, and they are for your benefit.